Most news reports, when they cover some sort of science or some expert opinion, they don't actually give you enough information that you can even find the study that is supposed to be based on. I chose to cover this news report simply because it's the only one I've ever seen where I can look at them covering obesity and the actual study behind it and look at the difference. And in fact, I even did a study where I went out and gave a survey to people to see what they thought the study said based on this news coverage.
Some health studies in recent years have suggested that being obese may not mean a person is unhealthy, especially when considering factors like cholesterol and blood pressure. But according to new Canadian research, that belief may bring a false sense of safety and hide serious risks. Kim Brunherber explains.
88 fingertips up.
Isabel Ford.
Can you be fit and overweight?
Absolutely.
And Suzanne Grayson.
I can honestly say that I've never felt healthier in my life.
Sure, they both share bad numbers. They have a body mass index of over 30, which means they're obese. But they say it's the good numbers that matter most. Their metabolic numbers like blood sugar and cholesterol.
Go in for my checkups. You know, she's always impressed by how healthy I am.
My doctor says that my tests come back better than hers.
Doctors have had a reason not to worry themselves too much if their patients were overweight but their metabolic numbers checked out. Over the last decade or so, a handful of highly publicized studies suggested you could be overweight, even obese, and still be healthy if you had good metabolic numbers.
I was studying sports science when the largest ever meta-analysis of 2.88 million came out and showed obesity type 1 and type 2 was associated with lower mortality. And a Norwegian study with 1.7 million came out before I was born, and the lowest risk group in that study was mostly in the overweight group. You can't tell me the results of those studies were highly publicized when I had never heard of them. I was being taught from some ancient bus driver study and insurance studies from the 70s that are not representative of the general public. The only studies that were referenced in a 3-year degree were heavily curated to only show higher risk. You can't imply that the public is being exposed to a dangerous lack of exaggeration from the media.
When you saw that study come out that said essentially...
Dr. Caroline Kramer didn't buy it, so she decided to do her own long-term analysis.
They emphasize the word long-term as though her study is contrasted to a bunch of short-term studies, but really it would be hard to find studies that include shorter time periods than what she's picked. The data is mostly based on 10-year periods, which is just standard.
So we are clearly showing that it's not okay to be obese, even if you don't have any kind of metabolic problems.
Her results are based on 8 studies that tracked more than 60,000 people over 10 years. The results showed that obese people who had normal metabolic numbers had a 24% increased risk of heart attack, stroke, and death.
Again, he emphasized 60,000 as though he's contrasting with meta-analyses that have lower numbers, when in actual fact it would be harder to find any meta-analysis with lower participants. But more egregiously, this result was not based on 8 studies and 60,000 over 10 years at all. In total, 23,300 people from 4 studies were used in the comparison made. To get to the 24% number, you have to exclude 4 of the studies that were initially included using their own criteria. It just so happens all the ones they excluded have opposing results. He also emphasizes the word death, but this is not referring to death. A 24% increase in death was never recorded. What she has done is lumped all events, including death, together. So for example, my granddad, who had multiple heart attacks and strokes, but lived to 96, would have multiple data points in the study, whereas a skinny person who had a heart attack around the age my granddad had his first heart attack and died immediately would only have 1 data point. This might seem like a cherry-picked hypothetical, but that is the trend in the data. That is why the 2.88 million participant meta-analysis that only looks at death shows overweight, obese type 1 and 2 have lower occurrences of death than normal weight. The other thing that is obvious if you are thinking critically at all is that he doesn't say what the increase is compared to. It's true that science is going to use specific language and it might be hard to condense it into more colloquial terms, but in order to give a quick and accurate view of the data, I just convert it into a graph. You start to wonder whether they do actually want to give an accurate picture or just emphasize the danger of one particular aspect. As you can see, the obese healthy group has a lot lower risk than the average risk, and they also have a lower risk than the average risk for a normal weight person. The most immediately striking thing, though, is how much more risky having bad metabolic numbers are compared to weight, something which they overlook and de-emphasize in this coverage, especially at the end. You should also pay attention to the order of increased risk. Normal weight with bad metabolic numbers is the highest risk group. Below that is overweight with bad metabolic numbers, and then obese with bad metabolic numbers. And if you think that the media is just useless and the researcher is not biased, look at this from the actual study. They write, the metabolically unhealthy obese group, which in theory is the highest risk group, but when we look at the included studies, 6 of them found that normal weight metabolically unhealthy had the highest risk. Only one of the studies conforms to her theory, which is not really a theory, just an assumption. To people who have paid attention to the scientific literature, this should not be surprising. For example, this study that looked at 3 different ethnicities in Fiji showed that among those who had diabetes, the fattest had less than half the risk of death than the normal weight people. Studies that look at those who had heart attacks show that the fatter ones have much better chances of survival afterwards. Also, the whole emphasis is on the difference between obese healthy and normal weight healthy. But then she calls the difference between normal weight and obese unhealthy groups as similar. You could say that this was due to the design of the study using the normal weight healthy as the reference group. Thus, a statistical difference wasn't able to be established. And of course, it is true you shouldn't just mess around with your methodology after the fact. Except they totally did that anyway. As you can see in the abstract, they used the 1.24 number that is gained by excluding a bunch of studies that they originally included, and then they compare it to numbers from the metabolically unhealthy that conform to the original design of the study.
We are not telling people that they have to be skinny, but these results shows that if you are overweight, if you are obese, you should make some changes.
But what if you're obese and fit? The study didn't directly account for people like Grayson.
I exercise about 3 to 4 times a week. I do 30K bike rides on a regular basis.
The researchers say eating well, not smoking, and exercising is the key at any weight, because they found being skinny and unhealthy can be almost as deadly.
Again, this is totally ambiguous, non-scientific language, but it sounds like he's saying that if you are in this group and you don't exercise, then you could be almost as unhealthy as someone in this group who does exercise. Or in mathematical terms, 1.19 is almost 3.14. No, it's not. That is not what researchers have found. And he couches it in language where he's trying to sound like he's being nuanced or giving a fair, balanced assessment, but it's complete nonsense. So you could see how I could easily do a survey and find people score worse than a random number generator when asked questions about the study that this is covering. The twist is that I did it for sports science students who think they are the experts to tackle the obesity epidemic, and even the postgrads did worse than random. Someone who is interested in the public's understanding of statistics in the media is economist Tim Harford. I found a great quote from him that happens to be on obesity from the People I Mostly Admire podcast.
Let me give you a specific example. The Health Secretary of the UK said over the summer, if everybody in the country who was overweight lost 5 pounds, then the British National Health Service would save £150 million over 5 years. That's about $250 million. And loads of people emailed me and said, hey, you're the data guy, Tim. How does he know this? What's the evidence base for this? My answer was, hang on, we don't need to go into an evaluation of the evidence base for this claim. We just need to understand what the claim is. The population of the UK is about 70 million. So he's basically said, if people lost weight, would save a couple of pounds per person. Actually, if I remember rightly, it was £100 million, so it was £1.50 per person. And it was over 5 years. So now he's talking about 30 pence per person. This is about 50 cents. So what he's saying is if everybody who's overweight lost weight, then the UK's healthcare system would save 50 cents per person per year. At which point you go, well, it doesn't really matter.
I like this quote so much that I'm going to go on a tangent. Because even though he happens to be talking about the obesity epidemic, Harford was making a more general point. That reminds me of a Nutella ad I saw as a child. The ad has a woman in her kitchen and she says something like, Nutella has 30% less fat than peanut butter and 10% less sugar than many jams. At the time, putting sugar in peanut butter would have been unheard of in New Zealand. And jam doesn't have any fat. So even as a child, I knew immediately that having 2 pieces of bread with Nutella would have more fat and more sugar than one with jam and one with peanut butter. Just from the information provided and the knowledge that peanut butter doesn't have added sugar and jam doesn't have fat. To demonstrate how within the means of any normal person these calculations should be, I went to the totally mundane normal reality of my apartment and found these products. We have a jam that claims to have 25% less sugar than another jam, so Nutella's claim that their spread has 10% less sugar than many jams is probably already true of most jams. This one has 25% less sugar than a particular jam product. But are there many of that particular jam product on shelves? Are there many other jams that have the similar amount of elevated sugar? Probably. I couldn't find peanut butter because, la-ti-da, I've only got these substitutes. But they have no sugar and similar composition to peanut butter, which should just be made of peanuts. So I will compare 100 grams of Nutella substitute to 50 grams of jam and 25 grams of each peanut butter substitute and tally up the fat and sugar content. So if we do this, it turns out the choc hazelnut has 15% more fat and 112% more sugar and 1/3 the protein. In fact, just looking at the label, we can tell that only 16% of the hazelnut spread isn't either sugar or fat. But if we just edit the information the way the ad did, we can still say the spread has 42% less fat than peanut butter and 11% less sugar than many jams. That is, it has 11% less sugar than the jam that has 33% more sugar than the one I had on my shelf. What they basically did was compare one piece of Nutella spread toast to a peanut butter and a jam piece of toast, instead of the more fair comparison of 2 pieces of Nutella with a peanut butter and a jam spread. I'm confident that any normal person could have this pointed out to them without even much explanation. But if that's so, why did they make the ad and continue to run it? The statement about the cost of obesity can also be dissected using primary school math. The 24% statement in the news coverage can be dismissed as meaningless simply because he makes a comparison without saying what the comparison is to, and the fact that the wording is so ambiguous as to what was even being measured. But the prima facie statements presented say that being skinny and metabolically unhealthy is almost as unhealthy as being fat and healthy, which would lead me to conclude that a measly 24% increase in risk is the upper limit outside of people who are obese and metabolically unhealthy, when in fact the increase in relative risk for being skinny and unhealthy is actually about 11 times the increased risk.
That belief may bring a false sense of safety and hide serious risks.
So if we look at the spectrum of scientific debate and results within peer-reviewed literature, we could say that this lady is arguing in the alarmist corner of the debate. And yes, there is a debate, by the way. But the comment section is out in the infrared, making statements that are simply not seen in the scientific literature. This YouTube only has 2 comments, the longest being by a user named Tofu. Let's see what amazing insights Tofu has to tell us.
Come in, Alpha. Alpha, do you read?
Tofu seems to have concluded that the lady at the end will die young, despite her exercising. Dying young is uncommon enough that even those in the highest risk group of this study are not likely to die young. Tofu is somehow able to judge her diet just by her weight. Of course, the original study looked at weight, so if that were possible, it would already be taken into account. But the only statistic mentioned in the coverage was 24%. I can't expect Tofu to actually look at the original study or the scientific literature in general. So they don't know that 60,000 isn't that many participants. They don't know that it wasn't based on 60,000 anyway. And they don't know that the actual number is 19%. They could, however, have considered that it is ambiguous what the 24% measures, and that it isn't compared to anything. They haven't considered this. Maybe they think it's a 24% increase compared to the average risk factor, which would be up here. Or perhaps they think it's compared to the average risk factor for normal weight people, which isn't much different. Of course, the metabolically healthy do not have a higher risk, they have a lower risk compared to this. So had Tofu thought this through enough to conceptualize anything, it would already be wildly off of the reality of the results of the study. But they don't seem to have conceptualized anything. Tofu doesn't even seem to understand the number 24. So I have converted it into blocks. 24 is close enough to 25, so I will represent the uninformed misunderstanding of what the news presenter said like this. The presumed normal weight or average risk factor is represented by 4 blocks, and the healthy obese person is represented by 5 blocks. Even if we assume the comparison is to all normal weight people, which it isn't, and the statistic relates to death, which it doesn't, the obese person only has 1 extra block. The normal weight person still has 4 blocks. So if the obese person does die, there is a 4 out of 5 chance it was not because they were obese. And if it's a certainty that the obese person is going to die young, then the normal person has an 80% chance of dying young also. In which case, it wouldn't be considered dying young or early, it would just be a typical life expectancy. If people read and understood only the literature of scientists who are emphasizing the harm, such as the study being represented here, the results will be that they realize there is a lot less risk and certainty than they thought. Even in a study like Manson et al. That found the most harm of any study, they say very clearly in the introduction that the results from different cohorts are all contradictory and completely different, including studies that got the complete opposite results. I'm someone who, after reading a lot of scientific literature on obesity, would be on the blue end of the spectrum. But if I were to try to bring Tofu over to my side, it would surely be impossible. But just thinking critically and understanding numbers will filter out Nutella ads, bizarre exaggerated interpretations, and the outrage someone might feel when they want their £100 million but don't realize they are worried about less than 1 cent per week. But it's a much bigger ask to go and find the study that coverage is based on, even if it is freely available as this one is. But you almost always get a totally different picture if you do. Actually reading the broad scientific literature on a topic is even more so. At least that's my experience looking at the scientific literature for obesity.